Can you hear me properly? Thank you. So the title of my presentation today is Women at Aligarh and Jamia, Guardians of Tradition or Actors of Change. This is based on a book that I'm currently finishing on the political role of Aligarh and Jamia after independence. And this chapter more specifically looks at the evolution of women's location at AMU and Jamia from the last years of the colonial period to the 1990s. In this chapter, I ask two main questions. First, how did women who were originally confined to the margins of these institutions become central actors there? And second, did AMU and Jamia's Muslim character affect the discussions on women's status in these institutions? Now, why this second question? Well, in the Satchar Committee report, there's this interesting quote. Women in general are the torchbearers of community identity. So when community identity is seen to be under siege, it naturally affects women in dramatic ways. Women, sometimes of their own volition, sometimes because of community pressure, adopt visible markers of community identity on their person and in their behavior. However, what we have to remember is that this notion that women are symbols of, are often seen as the guardians of a separate community identity is highly contingent upon context. And so what I will argue is that women's education at AMU's Women's College in particular, remained for a long time essentially a class project, which focused on the formation of well-mannered, respectable women, especially at a time when access to higher education was still restricted to either middle class or upper middle class students. And with the rise of independence, this educational project was recast in a nationalist framework. College authorities focused primarily on training modern Indian women ready to serve the nation, rather than on cultivating religious difference, even though, of course, most students were Muslim. It's mostly in the 1970s and 80s, as the debates on the Muslim character of this institution and also of Jamia, as we will see, and intensified on campus, and the debates around Muslim personal law crystallized rising communal tensions, that women increasingly came to be seen as the guardians of a separate Muslim identity. Now, today I will only focus on the period before these evolutions in the 1970s, on a period going from the late colonial period to the 1960s. During this period, women became increasingly visible and active on campus, both at Aligarh and Jamia. And women's education simultaneously sought to transmit sociocultural values and redefined women's role as citizens serving society and nation. So first of all, let me start with a very quick reminder of the trajectory of these women, which started at the margins of these institutions. Some of what I will say, of course, has been said already, so I'll try to be fast. Like most schools and colleges in colonial India, AMU and Jamia were initially meant for men. It was in 1906, as we have said, that one of Sir Said's disciples, Sheikh Abdullah, and his wife, Begum Abdullah, established a girls' school in the vicinity of the MAO College. The prime objective of this school, which became a college in 1937, was to train companionate wives and educated mothers. It contributed to the self-fashioning of a social group, i.e. the North Indian Muslim Ashraf elites, at a time when Sharif identity depended increasingly on respectability, not simply on birth. And so, as we have just seen, to convince Sharif families to send their daughters to school, the founders had to demonstrate that Purdah rules would be strictly implemented, which, by the way, was not specific to Muslim institutions. For example, in IP College 2, students had to travel in horse carriages covered with curtains. Now, this contributed, according to Gail Minault, to an institutionalization of Purdah. More generally, she argues, and Shadab has shown, the school's focus was on continuity rather than change, as teachers emphasized continuity with the household. In the late colonial period, as we have just seen, these rules started to loosen. For example, girls were allowed to attend mushairas. A few female students also started joining classes on campus, but they remained a small minority. So in 1946, for example, there were 17 female students at postgraduate level in the Faculty of Arts against 365 male students at the same time. Now, in contrast to AMU, Jamia never had a separate college for women. Jamia alumni are often proud of the fact that their institution offered co-education at all levels. They see in the adoption of co-education a marker of Jamia's progressive ethos. Now, much like Aligarh, however, what we have to remember is that Jamia started de facto as an institution by men for men. Jamia's founding figures were all men, so too were Jamia's first students and the vast majority of teachers. But women, as we all know by now, were not absent from campus, far from it. So of course here I won't dwell on details because we've been looking at this very extensively. But just a few points. Most of Jamia's first generation of women were the daughters, sisters, and spouses of Jamia teachers and staff members. While men were at the forefront of Jamia's development, mostly, women's efforts to adapt to a frugal lifestyle in a small basti, deprived of basic facilities, made it possible for Jamia's experiment to take off. So did their commitment to their newly found family. These women usually practiced parda in line with the social norms of the time. They often met among themselves, be it for religious functions or, as we saw yesterday, for literary gatherings. And it is in this context that some of them, like Saliha Hussein, but many others, went on to publish their own short stories, novels, or poetry. Jamia's women, as we also saw, engaged in social work and education from a very early stage. These activities first started informally as they gradually built strong ties with women in Okla's village. Now, for example, yesterday I think that it's Sayyida Hamid who mentioned Nabila Begum. Nabila Begum taught the Holy Scriptures to women and children in Okla and offered classes inside her home. This form of social work had, as was often the case at Jamia, strong religious underpinnings. Nabila's efforts to teach the Quran were considered to be, in Sugra Mehdi's words, as a pious work and a great deed. Within this framework, it appeared legitimate for these burqa-clad women who followed strict Parda rules, according to Sugra Mehdi, to undertake work outside her home. Jamia's women subsequently set up an institutional framework for these social work activities, most visibly, as we saw this morning, when Siddiqa Kidvai started the Balak Mata Centers in 1951. So through these cultural, social, and educational activities, women gradually carved out a space for themselves at Jamia and extended the scope of the school's activities to women in the neighborhood. They also played a decisive role in girls' integration at Jamia school. It's worth remembering that coeducation was not initially an integral part of Jamia's educational project. According to Saliha Hussein, it was Jamia's women who started girls' education, while, I quote her here, their husbands did not care much for it. They started girls' education quietly, chupke chupke, at home, by calling instructors, so that girls could take exams privately. Eventually, school authorities allowed girls to join classes alongside boys. Practical considerations more than purely ideological inclinations here played an important part in this decision. The first female students were often the daughters or the sisters of Jamia's teachers and workers, and the family-like atmosphere in a close-knit community probably encouraged Mujib and his colleagues to opt for co-education, especially at a time when Jamia hardly had the resources to start a new school reserved for girls. Moreover, by 1949, Delhi state government had decided that all primary basic schools should become co-educational. So it is in this context that Jamia School opened its doors to girl students alongside boys. Mujib himself recognized that co-education came to be seen as a valuable project only in hindsight. I cite him here. At the beginning, girls were admitted not because of some educational principles, but once it was begun, Jamia members realized the benefits of it. And so it is true that from this point onwards, Jamia authorities made special arrangements for girls. For example, they built a separate girls' hostel for girls whose families didn't live in Delhi. They also granted a few scholarships for female students, even if there were few. And they continued to allow private students to take schools exam. At AMU, separate education for women remained the rule until graduation. But within the Women's College, the contours of women's education gradually evolved, opening up new opportunities for female students. After independence, the college continued to attract students from educated middle class or upper middle class families, including some of Jamia's alumni, who joined AMU to pursue higher studies, which were still less developed at Jamia at the time. In continuity with the colonial period, college authorities paid special attention to the inculcation of good manners, which was an important marker of social status. Sajida Zabir, a former student, recalls, for example, that the characteristic feature of the college was that girls educated there would combine high thoughts, unshi khayalat, with a life of great simplicity and sincerity. Sadgi or khulus. Sincerity and courtesy were the desired hallmarks of good behavior. Former students and teachers often praised the warmth and simplicity of Begum Abdullah and her daughters, Rashid Jahan and Mumtaz Haidar, who were projected as role models for the students. They emphasized the ease with which these educated elite women interacted with people of different social backgrounds. So, for example, Hamida Saidou Zafar, who was a professor of ophthalmology and the sister-in-law of Rashid Jahan, argued that the Abdullahs treated their servants as members of their own family, reducing class differences to a minimum. She insisted on the proximity between Rashid Jahan and, I quote, common women. According to her, Rashid Jahan, I cite her here, was loved and respected by the simple and rustic women, as well as by middle-class women, while society women, the nouveau riche and other pseudotypes, didn't think much of her. So unlike the nouveau riche, truly Sharif women did not need to assert their social superiority. As Saidou Zafar suggested, they distinguished themselves through their gentle and simple manners, the natural ease with which they addressed their peers, as well as people of lower social status. College authorities presented simplicity as a virtue, but they also wanted their students to develop refined taste, zok, yet another marker of women's social status. In 1976, the Women's College magazine published a series of short portraits of Aligarh's prominent women, in which the editor, Shahnaz Hashmi, repeatedly emphasized the taste of these women and their cultural skills. For instance, Sashi Agarwal, an economist, was a connoisseur of roses. Zinat Ansari, a doctor and head of the Department of Pediatrics, had a great passion for music, and her daughter, Zeba, a medical student, played the sitar. Nazma Mukhtar, wife of a professor of Arabic, was charming and well-dressed and had a beautiful garden. To transform their students into women of taste, college authorities encouraged them to take part in cultural activities and to develop literary skills in Urdu, a language strongly associated, of course, with tehzeeb. The Persian and Urdu society was meant to quench, I cite here the women's magazine again, the students' literary thirst and to develop further their literary taste. College teachers also encouraged the students to submit plays and essays to the Women's College magazine and to participate in short story competitions. At a time when Urdu medium education was on the wane in the country, college authorities thus encouraged their students to act as carriers of tradition, contributing to the transmission of Urdu tehzeeb. At the same time, college authorities insisted on the need for students to acquire a good command over English, the main language of modern educated Indian middle classes. College authorities insisted on the need for their students to learn the right pronunciation, that is, a pronunciation closer to that of native speakers or of the Western educated Indian elites. In 1958, for instance, Audrey Ahmed, a lecturer in Russian at AMU, gave students a lecture on English pronunciation and accent and asked students to imitate her pronunciation. In 1964, 4 American tutors sent by the American Education Foundation joined the college to help the girls improve their English. College students were to become the perfect examples of the new Indian women rooted in tradition yet open to modernity. So we can see how, in continuity with the colonial period, the Women's College continue to complement AMU's work in the production of English-educated Muslim middle classes. Yet, for college authorities, the purpose of women's education went beyond this objective. Increasingly, after independence, they saw college education as a means to train self-confident women no longer confined to their roles as wives, mothers, or daughters. According to the editor of the Women's College magazine in 1956, the purpose of the college was to provide the right literary atmosphere that would allow students' blossoming personalities to thrive. The purpose of literary activities was not simply to transmit a cultural legacy, but also to help students develop greater self-confidence. By organizing drama, essay, or short story competitions, they aim to train students to face a public audience and to display their skills. College authorities also made special efforts to develop sports activities on the campus. In 1958, they formed a games committee to coordinate different activities, including netball, throwball, volleyball, table tennis, and badminton. They also organized inter-hostel competitions. For Razia Khan, the college principal in 1970, games and sports constituted an essential part of the education program at the college, as they helped develop discipline, teamwork, good spirit, and good health. Ifat Ara, a college teacher, insisted on the virtuous character of such activities. She argued that if girls were to read books all the time, they would become lazy, whereas regular exercise would allow them to develop a beautiful and healthy body. By promoting physical activities as a central part of women's education, college members thus proposed a model of virtuous behavior for women which incorporated some values otherwise often associated with men, such as physical vigor. Although the college remained an enclosed space, it thus subtly redefined women's model of conduct and sphere of action. It provided them with a platform where they could cultivate a set of skills and build up a sense of self-confidence as individuals independently of their roles as daughters, wives, or mothers. Furthermore, in the post-partition context, college authorities increasingly encouraged their students to go out of their homes to play a useful role in society, primarily in the promotion of women's education. Sare mulk pe jao, talim ko pelao, Sheikh Abdullah reportedly told his students. College authorities repeated to their students that access to higher education was a privilege which involved in turn responsibilities. Every year, on Founders' Day, college members celebrated the establishment of the college, presented as a victory of the forces of progress and enlightenment against obscurantism and narrow-mindedness. College teachers reminded their students that despite these victories, they were still near the starting point of a long race. And so as educated women, the role of these students was to become torchbearers for the cause of women's education. They were more largely to serve social development, going beyond communal boundaries. Mumtaz Haider, the principal, proudly reminded her audience that the alumni served the subcontinent as doctors, teachers, research scientists, technicians, social workers, legislators, librarians, and artists, thus turning away from the bitter memories of partition. On Founders' Day, she recalled that at the time of partition, Sheikh Abdullah was busy demarcating the building of the college. He believed, she said, that, I quote her, whether or not partition would take place, social progress could not stop. Haider thus dissociated the domain of social progress, in which women could legitimately intervene, from the domain of politics, in which the women's college supposedly had no stake. Through social service, women were to participate in nation building in a peaceful manner, staying away from communal rivalries. For Mumtaz Haider, the college formed a privileged platform for national integration, even though most students were Muslim. There, she said, national integration was not an ideal, but a lived reality, where women of different religious backgrounds could live and dream of the future together as sisters. Within this framework, college authorities increasingly urged students to join a profession as yet another way to contribute to the development of the nation. In 1966, college authorities established a women's polytechnique, which offered students a wide range of professional courses, not only suitably feminine courses, such as costume design or secretarial practice, but also electronic engineering. In the early 1970s, they decided to start short and long-term job-oriented courses. I cite them here so that girls could find a job more easily. However, few students initially took up a profession after completing their studies. The director of the university's Polytechnique regretted that not more than 5% of the university-educated women were able to get a remunerative job. The 5% is his figure, not mine. For him, this constituted an infructuous investment for the state. So what we can see is that by the 1960s, college authorities considered that, and early 70s, college authorities considered that educated women could no longer be confined to their roles as wives and mothers. The nationalist rhetoric helped legitimize women's new roles in the public sphere, but within limits. For college authorities, the prime objective was to serve the nation and society, but not necessarily women's emancipation per se, a discourse that feminists in the 1970s questioned head-on. Now, beyond the women's college, female students became increasingly visible and active on the university's main campus, where they interacted with male students and teachers. Some postgraduate students got involved in student politics, as they were allowed to take part in the elections of the university's students' union. And in 1954, for the first time, a woman, Zohra Naqvi, joined the union's cabinet. Undergraduate female students were not supposed to take part in political activities on the main campus, but they sometimes broke these rules. In 1950, for instance, 3 of the famous Zaidi sisters were arrested after they participated in a black march organized by the Students' Federation. This type of protest allowed students to bridge the gap, albeit temporarily, between the women's college and the main campus. Cultural activities formed yet another site for interactions between men and women inside the university. During the 1950s, women began increasingly to join cultural groups on the main campus. Some performed on stage alongside men, and university authorities even sent groups of men and women to represent the institution at youth festivals organized by the central government. Around the same time, at Jamia, girls and women started going on stage to perform plays alongside boys, as Sayyida Hamid reminded us yesterday. A few faculty members resented the fact that Zakir Hussain and Professor Mujib encouraged these performances. According to Habib Tanvir, who was mentioned this morning, even Mujib Sahib had to often keep quiet, I cite him here, in front of mullahs and molvis who were critical of drama performances on campus. But it seems that these resistances remained relatively muted at the time. Sorry, my apologies. Yes, I have one page is missing. My apologies for this. I found it. Now, these tensions were more marked at AMU, where mixed-caste performance crystallized tensions between the progressive and conservative sections of the university. While some students saw in mixed-caste performances a significant evolution to be celebrated, others regarded them as a breach in the moral order. According to Nehru, some students opposed the proposal to have an auditorium on campus, I cite him here, on the plea that it might be used for plays and dramas in which girls might take part. These students saw in these performances a means for communists, quote unquote, to propagate their ideas and, again, quote unquote, to undermine our traditional religious culture. By opposing these performances, the students sought not only to preserve a moral order on the campus, but also to avoid the propagation of left ideas, two objectives which they considered to be closely intertwined. Likewise, at Jamia in 1960, a few faculty reportedly complained about the changing character of Jamia, which they attributed, I cite them here, to the ill effects of coeducation, as well as to the corrupting influence of dance, music, drama, and to the growing number of communists among the teaching faculty. So we can see how women acquired a distinct visibility on campus, even though they remain small and few in numbers, either as symbols of progress or as a potential threat. The debates around their visible presence and interactions with men became a proxy for the debate on the definition of these institutions' Muslim character. And so to quickly conclude, these debates gathered momentum in the 1970s and 80s. On the one side, some teachers, influenced by feminist movements, started questioning gender hierarchies on campus and insisted that women's emancipation should become the prime objective of women's education. In the same period, however, the renewed debate on AMU's Muslim character, the rise of Islamist groups, and the larger debates about Muslim personal law in the larger public sphere made the question of religious the question of religious identity more central for women at the university. With the rise of communal tensions, many women further internalized the idea that adopting a critical stance either towards their institutions or towards Muslim personal law could be seen as a form of betrayal, exposing their community to further attacks. As Muslim women, students and teachers were expected to prioritize the defense of their institutions and, through them, of their community. Women have since then learned to negotiate their location on campus and to expand their opportunities within this framework. And despite these constraints, they have become increasingly assertive actors in the university's political lives, as the recent anti-CAA protests have demonstrated. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadab. Thank you, Laurence. Two very rich presentations. Let me just briefly flag a few things that I found interesting, and then we'll open this to comments, questions that the audience might have. While it would seem that for Sheikh Abdullah, female education was a muhim, a crusade, at Jamia it seemed to have happened more organically, more naturally. My sense is that in the early days it was the daughters of the ustads who came to study there, and only gradually it opened up. I think you mentioned the years from which women students start coming in. So it's initially the Jamia Biradri, which is the catchment area for the girls who come in. But I don't think gender is such an issue at the Jamia. I don't think parda is such an issue at the Jamia as it is in the early days of Aligarh. I think in his zeal to ensure education for women, Sheikh Abdullah possibly goes the extra mile. In Mushahidat al-Tazkira, there is this very interesting, very funny actually incident. Girls from, this is of the time when the school has shifted to Maris Road, its present location, and girls would come in dolis and small covered palanquins. And they would be from the Sheher, or they would be from where the university is now, which back then was considered a fair distance from Maris Road. Now girls coming in, these little girls in dolis, there would be boys who were paid by local wardis to fling open the parda on the doli. And those little girls in those dolis would be terrified and screaming, just out of pure mischief to discourage girls from going. And Sheikh Abdullah says, उन तक ये खबर पहुंची और एक रोज़ वो झाड़ियों में छुप के इंतज़ार कर रहे थे, हाथ में डंडा लेके. जब वो बच्चे आए वहाँ से, and there were urchins who'd been paid to do this. When those boys came, he pounced on them. And then he found out who was doing this, and he sort of, scolded them and so on. So while he was doing everything in his power to make sure that girls are coming to school, I think it was a means to an end. He really needed these girls to come to the school that he and his wife had set up. And possibly he went too far. Shadab, you flagged that incident of, it takes an Ismat Chughtai to point out the absurdity of Sheikh Abdullah, whom the girls call Papa Mia, addressing the girls from behind a screen. पर्दे के पीछे से उनसे बात करते थे. And in कागज़ी पैरहन, Ismat says, ये कैसे मुमकिन है और इसकी क्या ज़रूरत है. So it takes a while for this, what I think of as an obsession with parda, to, it doesn't quite go away, but it is curtailed, it is diminished. But in the process, I think parda and by extension segregation get normalized and get institutionalized. Shadab, you talk about that too. And I see its implications not just in Aligarh or in women's education, but in large parts of Muslim India. In the process, I think segregation and sharafat also get intertwined, and we are still facing the consequences of that. The other thing I want to flag, and which Laurence, you allude to, it takes 1966 for vocational education to come into Aligarh with the courses. And we have instances of other institutions, such as, for example, IT College, which is already back in the 30s and 40s offering courses, BT, which is a sort of a precursor to B.Ed, which is meant to train people for schools. And IT College also has a number of vocational courses, such as secretarial courses, shorthand and typing. Perhaps it has something to do with the kind of people who are coming, the kind of students who are coming to an IT college, set up by American missionaries. A great many of the girls are from the Anglo-Indian community. And vocational courses are not frowned upon as they are increasingly for girls from Muslim families. So maybe we see a reason for that. But it takes 40 years for these courses to come up in Aligarh, and an Ismat has to travel from Aligarh, leave Aligarh, and go to IT College to do the BTs so that she becomes an inspectress of schools. So yeah, I think both at Jamia and at Aligarh, we see that while education for girls is being encouraged, but I don't think it is at the cost of the kind of education that is to be given to boys. And I don't think girls are being trained to compete with boys for those jobs. I'll confine my remarks here and take any questions from the audience. Comments, questions. We have about 20 minutes. Yeah?
What sometimes may be missed a little bit is that these men had gone to Europe. They'd seen the interaction, not that Europe was so much advanced, but they carried with them a different experience in Europe, and they couldn't find that kind of intellectual companionship when they came back to India and expected the same from their wives. So they became a driving force for their wives. At the same time, I mean, Professor Mujib was also influenced by the fact that he had sisters who were much brighter than him. And his own brother, Muhammad Habib, the father of Irfan Habib, prevented these sisters from being sent abroad. So when the boys went to Oxford and England to study, the girls who were so much brighter were left behind. Their cousins, in turn, married German women or British women, came back and didn't have the guts to say that, oh, we are already married to a German or British woman, and married the sister of, in this case, of Muhammad Mujib. So the influence, I think, of Europe, then the influence of the Christians, so Amrit Kaur, then the influence of Suhaila Tayyabji, who was the daughter of Abbas Tayyabji, growing up, I mean, Professor Mujib's generation and older, playing tennis. So I don't know what kind of Boras they are, Soleimani Boras, the Shias, the Sunnis, all in turn had different exposures, experiences, cultures, which I feel would inform each of these understandings, analysis of what happened and why more. And the freedom movement, I think, again, was such an opportunity. The frugality, the scarcity of Okla, but again, the freedom of movement giving so much more space to women. So I feel that among the men, there would have been many who would have wished for more than actually took place. I'm not talking about Sheikh Abdullah, but I know it of Professor Mujib that definitely his wife would have resisted the change because it would have put her at odds with her own peers group. The elder sister of the wife, Asifa Mujib, was a warden and got a salary. So although coming from a background that was wealthier than Professor Mujib, she'd choose a job. So I think there's so many influences in making, creating the space for women to advance. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, this is one of the impulses in the setting of the school at Aligarh. Sheikh Abdullah in Mushahidat says that raat aur din ka farak hai ladkiyon mein, I mean the pool that is available, and the educated boys. So initially, one of the reasons, of the many reasons that are there before him, one of them is also the difference. The boys who are coming out of the MAO college want educated wives. So I don't think it's just something that is happening in Mujib Saab's time in Aligarh, but in Jamia, we see it also happening in Aligarh, that the boys who are coming out of the college no longer want to be married to uneducated women. So I think that is also. Would you like to add to this, Shada?
Yeah, in fact, if we look into the initial concerns, that had been one of the very primary concerns and the kind of debate that was carried out in the debating society at the union, where men, the younger boys, now seeking companionship in educated women. But then the entire concept of what kind of education is also something that they would want them to be tied in domesticity, not very outgoing. So that kind of a discourse is also going on, and a resistance also to this when these younger men were speaking for women's education. They were voted down on the plea that they may get astray, that they might get modernized, and receiving modern education was a problem for women, not for men. So men considered their own education as something different and valuable, but women should have a certain kind of education. But some of them wanted women to be educated so as to put their house in order, because the house was also, this familial domain was also very much in the critical eye of the rulers, you see. So that was also kind of modernizing, but very gradually and partially, and doing it in a very guarded way. That we were speaking yesterday of kind of reconstituting patriarchy, kind of having a different kind of a control over women. I am much perplexed today of, you see, Laurence has so beautifully brought this entire narrative of post-independence changes in Aligarh and Jamia, more in Aligarh. And Professor Zoya Hassan has also spoken about her times of how different Aligarh was in the 60s and 70s. But the kind of continuity still that we find because of this structural arrangement of a separate school and the co-education still not a possibility for undergraduate education, you see, after 100 years. Even this possibility of undergraduate opening up for women students is not something taken up as a policy. So that is the reason why there is a backdoor entry of Quranic studies and theology getting co-education at this time. But many of these undergraduate courses are not taken into co-education thing. And the logic is, again, the founders and the school and that kind of a rationale that still comes up every time. So the continuity is still disturbing, and this is what I'm saying, it gets institutionalized. The structure is there already, and it's difficult to bring back to or to just kind of have that as a special women's college and co-education in the university, which is kind of a distant dream still.
A line from the Mushawarat is stuck in my head and I somehow can't get rid of it. Sheikh Abdullah quotes somebody as saying, "Ladkiyan agar padhengi to hurdangi ho jayengi." So the fear is not education per se, but the exposure. And also Sharif gharon ki ladkiyan phir non-Sharif gharon ki ladkiyon se bhi milengi. So this is also a fear. There are questions here. I think Saida Appa, you had something to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rakshi. When I look at the three of you, I think that, you cover this whole thing, this idea of the title of this Delhi Jamia's Women, Delhi and Beyond Ways into a Public Sphere. So I think, you three really symbolize, it was a Nishat's brainchild. So here it is, one of the second last session. I just have 3 small points. One is a very personal point, which is I never studied in Jamia, I never studied in Aligarh, but I have a very deep connection. So I'm asking this in a way. First, I want to say something which would be of interest to researchers, that there are two aulads of Mumtaz Appa still here with us. So I think they're very, very important for us to fan out, and not me, but the younger people to fan out and get as much from them as possible. That is. The other thing is about these 2 excellent presentations. I'm really fascinated. When you look at the Aligarh women and the Jamia women, we always think, the Jamia women were like dreams, the realization of a dream of the 3 founders. And now I think there were 3 women who are also on the top. Now slowly those women are going to come into the consciousness. And then there was Aligarh, which has a very different trajectory. But when you look at these 2, and this is the last sentence, when you look at these 2 sets of women's education, where do you find, how do you, in terms of hierarchy, where are they? Are the Jamia women on top, or are the Aligarh women on top? It's a very unfair question, but I'll just ask because I think that you might be able to. And Rakshi is sitting here, who's sort of also, part of this entire architecture. So that's a question. You can answer it all together when you're finished with the question, as the chair wishes.
Laurence, would you like to answer that? Yes, we just
in terms of, what do you mean exactly by hierarchy? You mean in terms of academic achievements, in terms of social status? I think actually this itself is an interesting question, because Jamia, of course, has deep historical connections and personal connections with AMU, but they also, the Jamia's founders and their successors, tried to also define Jamia's project in opposition to Aligarh. And one of the key points that alumni often brought up is this idea that Jamia had a more egalitarian ethos as compared to Aligarh, which had a more feudal mindset, and where maybe social hierarchies were way more important than at Jamia. So if we look at social status, many of Jamia and Aligarh came from a very similar social milieu, but maybe because AMU remained for a very long time a more elite institution, it maybe attracted even more people from privileged background, even though, of course, they were also present at Jamia. In terms of academic achievement, I think it's really important to remember that Jamia remained a very, was remarkable in the way in which they managed to become a pioneering school. But for a very long time, Jamia's college, so here I'm talking about higher education, remained very small. Higher education remained very limited at Jamia, and so quite understandably, AMU retained more prestige when it comes to academic achievement for the longest time. I think now that Jamia and AMU are both central universities, very well established central universities, these hierarchies, of course, are very much, under question. But certainly for a long time, there was this persisting idea that AMU was more elite, also because it wanted to be more elite. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I think Jamia is also battling a paucity of funds. There is a frugality. A lot of it is Gandhian frugality, but also it's coming from a complete space of a funds crunch. Zoya, you had a question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Both papers were really very, very interesting and fascinating and also very informative. I have actually two different sets of comments. One about the Aligarh and mainly about the Women's College, not about the university as a whole, but about the Women's College, which is what I presume your central concern is. On this whole Parda issue, it's interesting. I mean, there are clearly three phases as far as Parda and the Women's College are concerned. There's the Sheikh Abdullah phase that you're talking about, where there is a huge emphasis on Parda and so on. And as Rakshanda pointed out, possibly it's possible that he saw that as a way of getting women to come and study in the Women's College. Then there's the second phase in the 1960s, which you alluded to but did not elaborate. And that is when, at least when I was a student at the Women's College in the 60s, in the late 1960s, there was no Parda. I mean, it was almost, I mean, it wasn't the same as being in Miranda House or in, and so on, or in Lady Shri Ram College or possibly IT College in Lucknow. But it was as close as it could be to those institutions. After all, Women's College was in a small town, Miranda House and so on, in the Press College there in Delhi. So there was that difference, but there was, I mean, the milieu was very liberal, very progressive, not particularly different, because later on I came to Delhi and taught at the Lady Shri Ram College for some time before I joined JNU. And I mean, of course, there was some difference, but the atmosphere was not hugely different between Lady Shri Ram College and the Women's College. Whereas now, not that I've had any much contact with AMU or Women's College, it seems like we are returning, or rather, not we, the Women's College seems to have returned to Sheikh Abdullah's days. Now, I'm wondering what this tells us about Muslim politics in India and about Muslims, because I think these three phases, Parda, and then this very liberal progressive phase, and then now, when there's much greater emphasis on, on veiling or hijab and all of that. Now, I think so there is something much larger that is clearly at work that I think we need to look at. And the other, I think, which is a very interesting issue that both of you have alluded to, and I think Rakshanda also commented on that, is really the very different trajectories of AMU now, not the Women's College, but AMU and Jamia Millia. They're clearly different. I mean, AMU was this huge institution. Jamia was much more modest in comparison. But the difference again is that while the Women's College in the 60s was very liberal, clearly Jamia Millia was and is still very liberal. And there's that difference between the liberalism in Jamia and its and much less of that in AMU. And I'm wondering if we could reflect on these very different trajectories, because I mean, Jamia developed as an institution, frankly, only in the last 20 years. It was a very limited institution. It was very, very limited. It was really like, it was a college. It wasn't really a university. It took shape as a university in the past 20 years. But look at the way it has developed. It has really flowered, flourished, that it is now among the topmost institutions. It is constantly ranked among the topmost universities in India. And the same cannot be said about AMU, despite AMU having access to much greater resources, as I think Rakshanda was pointing out, than, let us say, Jamia. So I think, does this have to do with the fact that Jamia is located in Delhi and that the composition of Jamia students is not predominantly or entirely Muslim? You do have a very large number of non-Muslim students. You have a very large number of non-Muslim faculty in Jamia. And Jamia has developed differently in the last 20 years. I would say certainly from, let's say, 2002-03 to now, last 20 years really, is when Jamia has developed and flourished. So that, I think, the structural difference is not, I think, what Shadab was suggesting between there being a women's college there, confining women in undergraduate education, and in Jamia there's co-ed. Now that structural difference is important, but I think there are other factors which are also important, and I think it's fascinating actually, and I'm glad you're doing that in a way, is to really look at the very different trajectories of these two institutions and what that tells us about Muslims and about Muslim politics in India. Thank you.
Zoya, let me just comment on the politics part of it and leave Shadab to address the structural issue that you flagged.
Wanted to speak?
So one sec, can we just finish this and then we'll come to Wajad Saab. We talked about the politics of Parda. For Sheikh Abdullah, that Doli incident that I narrated, it was a means to an end. Let me narrate another one from a very recent visit to Aligarh. I met a bright young woman who is in the Students' Union, and she was wearing a hijab, not just a hijab, but a very elaborate one. And I asked her if she ordinarily wore one or wore one before standing for office or before coming to Aligarh. And she said she did it only in order to win this election. So for some women, a seat on the table is, if it means wearing a hijab, yes, they will wear it. That is what she conveyed to me. So I think in all these 100-odd years, we don't seem to have moved very far. If for Sheikh Abdullah, it was a means to an end to this bright young woman to have a seat on the table, if it means wearing a hijab, she will do it. Shada, please address the structural part.
You see, Parda would mean...
About the structural
So I'm speaking about Parda in terms of structure also, in terms of veiling also. So in the 1960s, when you see no Parda and quite liberal environment on the campus, this was something true, because by this time there was hardly veiling. And but by the you see the but what I emphasize is that the point that at that point of time, this gender consciousness in 1960s, as you were a student, I just would like to know from you that this gender consciousness, that the seats are not equal, the education for women and men was still not equal, a consciousness that came to women on the campus by late 1990s. So this is quite a development also, that the women students today are quite conscious of these gender disparities on the campus, and there is quite, even though they are in minority, there is a lot of struggle also by women students. I've kind of documented those women student struggles also, and the kind of discourse that they have taken up of gender equality is quite phenomenal too. So it's and many of these women might be veiling also. So the point is not the veil. And there are different types of veils also that is in question. So the point of there might be veiling for occupying the seat, or there might be veiling also to make an assertion of Muslim identity in a gathering like this. So there's a different purpose for male, and we need to understand why women are veiling and why women are veiling in a particular way also. There are different ways of veiling, and now with a different discourse coming on veil, we see the hierarchy in veil also. What is the ideal type of hierarchy? Now, what the thing is that this structural separation is something that, or this consciousness that this is very disparate education is quite a recent consciousness, and students have started speaking about the disparity in seats and all the something I think must have been in the 1960s, but the consciousness was not there. It was enough maybe for women to have a very liberal environment, or the opportunity to be in the boys' campus and have functions together, or going to perform in the Kennedy Auditorium, or that kind of a freedom was something that women cherished, something that has gone, that is no longer an opportunity for women today. You see, the spaces have constricted now. So what was available to women in 1960s is something that is not available. So this is what I see, again, a structural separation which has extended for women. This separation has become much more tight now. And regarding, did I answer your question?
Let's have one last comment from Wajah.
Can I just make that? Yeah, I'd just like to add. So I completely agree with you, Professor Hassan, about your point on Delhi and the importance of the location of these institutions. I think that's a crucial point. That's a point on which I elaborate in my chapter, because I go until today's period. But Whereas for a long time, Jamia remained in the shadow of AMU, also because Jamia was not inside Delhi. It was in the rural surrounding area of Delhi. Now it is very much part of the Delhi metropolis, and that was at a time when Delhi itself has changed tremendously. And whereas Aligarh now is seen as, you were talking about, a small town, is located in Aligarh, which is now considered to be, of course, a much smaller place. And it's interesting because earlier it was clearly the point of reference. Now Jamia is much more at the heart of things, if I may say, because of its location in the metropolis. But as you said, it only really started in 1980s, 90s, and that also corresponds to a time when Jamia became a central university. So I think these two factors are key to understand the fast development of Jamia at a late period. Now, to go back to your earlier point about Parda and the three periods, I'm a bit hesitant to talk of a return to the pre-1960s period because of the larger number of women who were a Parda on campus, because I don't think it's a return to the situation, to the colonial period. As Shada was suggesting, there are different ways of wearing the veil, different meanings associated with it, and we must not forget the evolutions that have taken place in between, including, for example, the rise of movements like Islamic feminism, that have tried to also give a different meaning to wearing the veil. So of course, some women may want to wear the veil out of because of social constraints, some for instrumental reasons, but some women also see wearing the veil as a form of self-assertion. It can also be, as I suggested very briefly at the end of my presentation also, it has to do with the evolution of Muslim politics, where women are increasingly seen as markers of a separate community identity, and as a result, becoming visibly Muslim becomes more important in that context.
Can I add? Okay.
I think we need to close now.
Okay.
My comment really follows through from the earlier questions that were raised, and that's regarding the personalities of those who've actually helped forge the course that the women's rights and the women's the college represents. I say this because the Habib family, Irfan Habib and Mujib and all, they are all we are all related, and so it's understandable their attitudes, what they were. But I don't think enough has been really done on the other key gentleman who has been talked about repeatedly, who is Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah, as you know, was a first-generation Muslim from Punch. Part of his brother's family all grew up in Punch as Sikhs. He migrated and came here, and then his greatest achievement was, of course, the fact that he set up this women's college. What do you think his background, and the quotation that Rakshanda had given about what he thought of women, that they should be like this and that, I can quite identify that with the ambience of Punch, where he came from. But now his wife was from altogether a different social milieu, and you brought out beautifully the differences in their attitudes, and of course their daughter was a leading communist of India, and also related to us because he was married to Mahmoud Zafar, who was my uncle. But wouldn't it be interesting to actually study the background of Sheikh Abdullah and his attitudes, and how, because obviously they had a key influence on the course the Women's College Aligarh was to take. And as you have mentioned also.
Yeah, I think Islam freed him in many ways.
Sorry?
I think Islam freed him in many ways, and he came without a caste baggage.
Yeah. But was his attitudes towards women and things like that, because the quotes that you had given from him, I would, having been in Punch myself for some time, I would immediately identify with himself with an intellectual, an educated intellectual from that part of the world. So, but anyway, it's just an idea. I mean, obviously you may not be able to answer that, because it's an idea about whether we need to study his background a little more to be able to understand his inputs.
Yes, we know quite a bit about him also through the biography of his wife that has written. He has come up with Mushaidat, his own Mushaidat, and the biography. Even when he's writing his wife's biography, we know a lot about him as well. What would have been his motivation, or why he was so much interested in women's education. What I gather from reading these texts is that he picked up these ideas not from his background, but from in Aligarh, and especially from the younger men who began to discuss it. And it was, he himself says that it was not such a pressing concern, or he didn't give much thought to it until the time he married. So the marriage was quite crucial. Maybe the time there was much of discussion on Mumtaz Ali was also training his wife for opening up the normal school. Now he has an educated wife. So this entire discussion of women's education, so he, in 1902, he becomes the secretary of women's education section. So maybe the fact that he becomes a secretary and the kind of person he was very active in duty society also. So his practical skills and the fact that he now has a responsibility, so he moves into that movement, and he was quite a practical person. And even after Ahmed was very appreciative of his talent, and that was the reason he was made the secretary. So regarding the background, yes, he was, as Rakshanda is saying, that he was freed of his kind of ties, and it was the new Sharif society. And but what Gail Minoy is also referring to, that this the Kashmiri Pandits culture and the Sharif culture, there was a lot of similarity too. So it was Kashmiri Brahmins. Yeah, but he was a Kashmiri. But he was a Kashmiri Brahmin.
All right. So Nishat has a question.
And there is one question to that.
Very quickly. No, I found this point that Laura made very interesting, which is about the difference between women's education and women's emancipation. Whenever we talk about women's education, we assume that it automatically means women's emancipation. And the other point is that when men talk about women's education, they do not necessarily have women's emancipation in mind, but when women talk about their education, do they also not think about women's emancipation? I mean, do they not have emancipation in mind? So are these two narratives different? We tend to sort of take them together, but maybe women apparently are towing the line, but then their own narrative is different. So that also needs to be looked at.
So this is something very personal I'm sharing today. Thank you for organizing something like this. So my mother, she did her master's from Aligarh Muslim University in the late 50s or maybe early 60s. So she belonged to Orissa, but she traveled all the way to Aligarh to study here. And she was an upper class Bengali Hindu woman. And at that time, as ma'am said, it was such a progressive liberal space, and I've heard such stories from her, such wonderful stories from her. She used to cycle to the campus every day from a hostel, and her roommate was a Kashmiri Muslim, and she would also cycle along with her, one in a sari, the other in a burqa. So I have these wonderful things that I've heard about from my mother about the space, Aligarh Muslim University. What a wonderful, syncretic, liberal, progressive space it was in the 60s, early 60s. Thank you.
Thank you.
So just to quickly answer your question, Nisha, thank you. Yeah, I think that even though we tend to associate education with emancipation, education does not necessarily lead to emancipation. And I think more importantly here, I think that it's more a question of what was the legitimatory framework. And I don't think that women's emancipation was used as the main justification for women's education even in the early independence period. I think that it was maybe not seen as strong enough a justification. So as I said, I think that the narrative was more to serve society, to serve the nation. And I think the ethos of service really, in a way, opened up new opportunities for women, but the opening up of opportunities was not the main goal in itself. Whereas in the 1970s, where you have the rise of the feminist movements, women's emancipation becomes explicitly a goal and is considered in itself to be a good enough reason and is considered to be the main, what should be the main justification for women's education.
Well, what a lively session this has turned out to be. Clearly, there are questions and comments still to be made. Let's carry them for tea, and let's close this session here. Thank you.